Next time you attend an amateur or professional mixed martial arts event in Canada, ask your fellow spectator the following 3 questions. In 2013, which Olympic sport did the IOC's executive board vote and recommend to be dropped as a core sport? If they answered wrestling, they probably first heard of this on an MMA-related website. Now the second question, who's the best Canadian wrestler? What a loaded question. What does that even mean? Assuming they don't ask for clarifications on best and which style of wrestling and at what weight division and whether it's the junior or senior level and which era and a variety of other questions, chances are they'll most likely say it's GSP, one of the greatest MMA fighters of all time, Georges St-Pierre. Yes, he's dominated various high-level wrestlers in MMA competitions, possibly making him the best Canadian wrestler in MMA. And although GSP might have allegedly considered trying out and wrestling for Team Canada, he never did. And it's fair to say that wrestling for MMA and wrestling for wrestling are obviously not the same. He's no Daniel Igali. Remember him? Canada's first ever Olympic gold medalist in freestyle wrestling. Or more recently, Carol Huyn, the first gold medalist for Canada in women's wrestling at the 2008 Beijing Olympic Games. Okay, third and last question. What's the main difference between freestyle and Greco-Roman wrestling? Now, of course, some mixed martial arts fans might know the difference, but if you followed up and asked them, what's the main format of a match? How does one score points? And how does one win? Would they be able to tell you? Okay, where am I going with this? After Daniel Igali won Canada's first ever Olympic gold medal in freestyle wrestling at the 2000 Summer Olympic Games in Sydney, Australia, I recall watching the highlight footage of his match, and the highlight mainly consisted of Igali's post-match celebration. And although the footage was visually powerful, especially if the viewer knew and understood the context to Igali's journey, what baffled me was, well, aren't they going to tell us and explain how he beat his Russian opponent to capture the gold medal? Or are they under the assumption that the mainstream Canadian viewer understands and comprehends the sport of freestyle wrestling, like they would the intricacies of ice hockey, curling, or friggin' figure skating? Yes, of course, there's obviously a community of amateur wrestling fans and supporters in Canada, but beyond this established stakeholder group, there's a broad audience of Canadian mixed martial arts fans who potentially could equally watch, learn, and support Olympic wrestling in Canada. Which leads us to the following. On April 28, 2016, the UFC announced a new partnership agreement with Wrestling Canada Lutte to actively promote amateur and Olympic wrestling throughout Canada. And yes, that's a win-win-win scenario for you, the UFC, for Wrestling Canada Lutte, and for Canadian wrestlers and wrestling as a whole. The #1 mixed martial arts promotion in the world, yes, the UFC, the Ultimate Fighting Championship, and Wrestling Canada Lutte, that's the national sports governing body for Olympic-style wrestling in Canada, have announced a partnership. Yes, the UFC Executive Vice President and General Manager for Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, Mr. Tom Wright, said, and I quote from the April 28th press release, quote, "Wrestling continues to be a major cornerstone of mixed martial arts, shaping countless UFC champions over the years. UFC is fully committed to supporting the development and growth of wrestling from coast to coast. Our sports share the same core values of discipline, integrity, and sportsmanship. We have a tremendous amount of respect for wrestlers as some of the most dedicated athletes in the world," unquote. Now, this is interesting because the UFC also has a partnership agreement with USA Wrestling, which began a few years ago. Now, I wonder if and how this partnership has further elevated USA Wrestling's profile and overall reach. Back to the press release. The president of Wrestling Canada Lutte, Mr. Don Ryan, says, quote, "Wrestling Canada Lutte is excited to partner with UFC. As wrestling is one of the foundations of mixed martial arts, there are many ways our communities can support each other given the natural fit," unquote. The press release goes on to say, quote, "UFC and Wrestling Canada Lutte will continue to support the overall development and promotion of wrestling. By leveraging UFC resources, Wrestling Canada Lutte and its upcoming events will be featured across organizational channels and platforms such as UFC broadcasts, social, and digital media. Wrestling Canada Lutte will provide its members with unique opportunities to experience UFC through a range of platforms including UFC events, UFC Fight Club, UFC Fight Pass, and International Fight Week activities. It'll be interesting to see how this partnership plays out and how wrestling will be further marketed and promoted in Canada. I'll be watching and just might do a follow-up story on this. The 2016 Rio Summer Games are 2 months away. All the best to the Canadian wrestlers and also all the Canadian judokas and boxers competing, as well as the Canadian judokas competing at the 2016 Summer Paralympic Games. Thank you for listening to Conversations with Garmamie. For more information, visit garmamie.com, that's Garmamie.com, or check out my Facebook page, Conversations with Garmamie.